Why Obote II feared his home and state house. Introduction. A president trapped by fear. In the study of African leadership during the turbulent decades of the Cold War, one figure stands out as both paradoxical and tragic. Apollo Milton Obote, the two-time president of Uganda. His second tenure, 1980 to 1985, known as Obote II, was defined not only by contested power and ruthless politics, but also by a deep undercurrent of fear that governed his every move. Unlike other heads of state who embraced the grandeur of presidential palaces, Obote often shunned his official residences, preferring instead to live in the confines of Nile Mansions Hotel, a place that carried its own haunted history of torture, death, and surveillance. Why did a president armed with the machinery of the state and backed by Tanzanian soldiers fear living in his own official state house? Why did Obote cling to a hotel room rather than the presidential palace in Entebbe or Kololo? To understand this, one must peel back the layers of Uganda's fraught history. The ghosts of Idi Amin, the shadows of coups, the tribal divisions within the military, and Obote's own paranoia, which grew until it consumed his leadership. This essay traces the fears of Obote II, exploring his political environment, his personal insecurities, and the symbolism of Nile Mansions as both a refuge and a prison. In doing so, it sheds light on how fear shaped not just a man, but the fate of an entire nation. Historical background: the rise, fall, and return of Milton Obote, Apollo. Milton Obote first rose to power in the 1960s as Uganda's founding leader after independence from Britain. A man of modest beginnings from Akakoro in Lango, northern Uganda, Obote was a skilled orator and strategist who quickly consolidated power. By 1966, he had orchestrated the abrogation of the Constitution, the storming of the Kabaka's palace, and the centralization of authority in his own hands. His first presidency, 1966 to 1971, ended abruptly when his army chief, Idi Amin, ousted him while he was attending a Commonwealth summit in Singapore. Obote fled into exile in Tanzania, where he spent nearly a decade watching Amin plunge Uganda into brutality and chaos. By 1979, Amin himself was overthrown by a coalition of Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles. A new transitional government was installed, but factionalism ran deep. In December 1980, Obote returned, contesting elections under his Uganda People's Congress, UPC party. Despite widespread allegations of fraud, Obote was declared winner, marking the start of Obote II. Yet, from the very beginning, his return was shadowed by insecurity. He had been deposed once before. He knew it could happen again. The rigged elections and rise of Obote II. The 1980 elections were meant to signal a rebirth for Uganda. Instead, they cemented its divisions. Obote's UPC faced fierce competition from Yoweri Museveni's Uganda Patriotic Movement, UPM, and Paul Simogarere's Democratic Party, DP. The vote was marred by violence, intimidation, and irregularities. Many Ugandans, especially in Buganda, believed Obote had stolen the election with the help of Paulo Muwanga, the powerful head of the military commission. Muwanga, a former ally of Obote, oversaw the electoral process and ensured UPC's victory was secured at all costs. Museveni, who claimed the elections were rigged, declared war, launching a guerrilla campaign that would later become the National Resistance Army, NRA insurgency. Thus, from its inception, Obote II's regime was born into a climate of illegitimacy, rebellion, and unrest. For Obote, these conditions heightened his paranoia. Every shadow became a threat, every whisper a conspiracy. The presidential palaces in Entebbe and Kololo, instead of symbolizing stability, became reminders of vulnerability. Why Nile Mansions? The president in a hotel, rather than living in the grand State House Entebbe or the presidential residence in Kololo, Obote chose Nile Mansions Hotel, today known as Serena Hotel Kampala. At first glance, it seemed bizarre. Why would a head of state downgrade to a hotel? The reasons were both practical and psychological. One, security concerns. Entebbe State House had been Idi Amin's seat of power. For Obote, moving in felt like walking into a haunted palace filled with Amin's ghosts, spies, and bad omens. He feared it was too exposed, too easy for assassins or coup plotters to strike. 2. Central location. Nile Mansions was in the heart of Kampala, near government offices and surrounded by heavy military presence. It allowed Obote to be at the center of power, close to the UPC headquarters, the army, and intelligence services. 3. Tanzanian influence. Tanzanian soldiers who had helped restore him to power were often stationed around Nile Mansions. Obote trusted their presence more than his own Ugandan forces, which were divided along ethnic lines. 4. Psychological comfort. Obote had been exiled once before. Hotels had become familiar places of refuge during his years abroad. Nile Mansions, though grim, offered him a controlled environment, a fortress disguised as hospitality. But there was an irony. Nile Mansions was notorious as a death hotel. During Amin's reign, it had been used as a detention and torture center. Prisoners screamed in the basements while dignitaries sipped whiskey in the lobby. By residing there, Obote placed himself atop a graveyard of Uganda's horrors. State House and Kololo fears, haunted palaces. Why did Obote avoid State House Entebbe and Kololo? The answer lies in symbolism and trauma. Entebbe State House. This coastal palace by Lake Victoria had been Amin's stronghold. For Ote, it symbolized betrayal. He had been overthrown while abroad, and Amin had moved into State House. Rumors abounded of spirits haunting the palace, tortured souls, coups, and blood. Obote feared both physical and supernatural threats. Kololo. The presidential residence in Kololo was strategically located in Kampala, but surrounded by hills that could easily become vantage points for snipers or rebel attacks. For a man already besieged by guerrilla warfare, it felt unsafe. Thus, instead of palaces, Obote chose a hotel, a paradoxical act that revealed both pragmatism and paranoia. Life inside Nile Mansions, whiskey, guards, and fear accounts from aides and observers paint a strange picture of Obote's daily life in Nile Mansions. He often sat alone in his suite, drinking whiskey late into the night. He was surrounded by Tanzanian bodyguards, whose loyalty he trusted more than Ugandans. Meetings were held in dimly lit rooms, with Obote often pacing, whispering, or growing agitated. Beneath the hotel, prisoners screamed, a chilling reminder of the fragility of power in Uganda. The president of Uganda lived like a fugitive in power, simultaneously at the helm of a nation and imprisoned by his fears. The death center, paradox. Nile Mansion's reputation as a torture center created a paradox for Obote. On the one hand, it was his refuge. On the other, it was a place of fear and death. Diplomats whispered about the screams that echoed at night. For ordinary Ugandans, the hotel was not a symbol of luxury, but of horror. By residing there, Obote blurred the line between state power and state violence. His presence atop such a haunted building became symbolic of his rule, legitimacy built on fear, survival perched atop suffering. Tribal politics and the army. Obote's fear of State House was also rooted in the volatility of Uganda's military. He relied heavily on his ethnic group, the Langi, and their allies, the Acholi. Yet even within this alliance, there was mistrust. He appointed Brigadier Smith Opan Akak, a fellow Langi, as army chief after the mysterious death of Oite Ojok. This move angered the Acholi, who felt sidelined. The army became divided, with some officers secretly sympathizing with Museveni's rebels. For Obote, this meant nowhere was safe, not even the palaces meant for presidents. The shadow of Oite Ojok. General Oite Ojok was Obote's most trusted ally, a brilliant, charismatic commander who held the army together. His sudden death in a helicopter crash in 1983 devastated Obote. Many believed it was sabotage. Without Ojok, Obote's fears multiplied. The army began to fragment, and Obote increasingly withdrew into isolation at Nile Mansions, drinking more, consulting fewer people, and growing erratic in his decisions. Obote's health and superstition. By the mid-1980s, Obote's health was failing. He reportedly suffered from high blood pressure and other ailments. At one point, he was flown to Milan for treatment. On his return, he was seen wearing juju bangles on his wrists, a rare departure for a leader who often mocked superstition. This suggested that Obote, the rational politician, was also turning to spiritual remedies in his final years, further evidence of how deeply fear had consumed him. The fall of Obote II. In July 1985, Obote was overthrown by his own generals, Tito Okello and Basilio Okello, both Akoli. They accused him of tribal favoritism and incompetence. When the coup came, Obote was not in State House. True to his habits, he was in Nile Mansions, surrounded by whiskey bottles and aides. He fled once more into exile, this time to Zambia, never to rule Uganda again. Conclusion: fear as the hidden driver. Why did Obote II fear his home and State House? The answer is not simply superstition. It was a combination of history, trauma, politics, and insecurity. He feared State House Entebbe because it symbolized betrayal and Amin's ghost. He feared Kololo because it was militarily vulnerable. He clung to Nile Mansions because it offered the illusion of safety, even as it was haunted by death. Ultimately, Obote's second presidency was one long negotiation with fear. Fear of coups, fear of rebellion, fear of betrayal, and fear of the very symbols of presidential power. His choice to live in a hotel rather than a palace was not merely eccentric. It was emblematic of a man trapped by his past, his enemies, and his own doubts. In the end, Obote II was not brought down by rebels alone, but by the same paranoia from ever feeling truly at home in his own nation. Word count 3,000.